You are a name whispered in the shadowed corners of the Palatine Hill, a flicker of a ghost in the annals of a fallen empire. But right now, you are flesh and blood. You are a boy. The cold of the marble floor seeps through the thin soles of your sandals, a cold that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with the stillness of the air, thick with the scent of myrrh, and something medicinal, something sharp and terrifying. Men in white robes move around you, their faces impassive, their hands efficient. They do not see a boy. They see a canvas. They see a vessel waiting to be filled with the ghost of another. Your own name, the one your mother gave you, is already fading, a word dissolving in the acid of a tyrant's grief. You are being prepared. The fine linen tunic you wear is a mockery, a shroud for the person you are about to cease to be. Soon, they will give you silks and pearls, the raiment of an empress, but it will all be a costume for a role you never auditioned for, in a play whose ending is already written in blood and madness. You look toward the gilded doors, behind which he waits. The emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, the god on earth whose sorrow has become your curse. He saw you in a crowd, a fleeting glance, and in the curve of your jaw, the line of your brow, he saw her. Poppaea Sabina, the wife he loved, the wife he killed. And in that moment of pathological recognition, your fate was sealed. You were no longer a person. You were a remedy, a living echo, a grotesque memorial. The men approach, their instruments glinting in the lamplight. There's a rope, a blade, a vial of something to dull the senses, but not the soul-crushing reality of what is about to happen. The cold on the floor is now inside you, a creeping paralysis of dread. You are Sporus, and you are about to be unmade, remade into the phantom bride of a grieving monster, an empress carved from the flesh of a boy. Your future stretches before you, a lavish, horrifying prison, a gilded cage where the bird has already had its throat slit, even if it is still forced to sing. The story of Sporus is one of the most disturbing and telling episodes from the reign of the Emperor Nero, a footnote in the grand narrative of Rome that reveals more about the nature of absolute power than entire volumes on military campaigns or senatorial decrees. It is a story that history often treats as a bizarre anecdote, a piece of evidence for Nero's madness, but to dismiss it as such is to miss its profound and chilling significance. This was not merely an act of personal insanity. It was the ultimate expression of a system where one man's psychological pathology could be weaponized by the full, unchecked authority of the state, turning a human being into an imperial decree. The transformation of a boy into the living effigy of a dead empress is a testament to the depths of systemic exploitation, where the lines between person and property, love and possession, reality and performance were not just blurred, but obliterated by imperial will. This is a journey into the heart of a forgotten horror, a truth hidden in plain sight within the chronicles of Rome, one that forces us to confront the terrifying reality of what happens when power becomes so absolute that it can rewrite not just laws, but human identity itself. It is a story about the commodification of grief, the pathology of power, and the quiet, desperate resilience of a soul trapped in the most public and private of nightmares. If you find value in uncovering the hidden, often brutal, truths that lie buried beneath the sanitized versions of the past, consider taking a moment to support this channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history. And to create a sense of our global community, united by a curiosity for these powerful stories, please leave a comment below letting me know where in the world you're listening from. It is a modern marvel that technology allows us to gather from every continent to bear witness to tales that were once confined to dusty scrolls, ensuring that the lessons they hold are never truly lost. To comprehend the grotesque tragedy of Sporus, one must first understand the world that made it possible, a world governed by a series of deeply entrenched legal, social, and psychological structures that concentrated almost unimaginable power in the hands of one man. The Roman Empire in the 1st century AD was a paradox of sophisticated legal theory and barbaric personal practice. At the heart of its social order was the concept of paterfamilias, the father of the family, a legal doctrine that granted the male head of a household absolute authority, known as patria potestas, over his entire extended family. This power was, in its purest form, absolute. It included the power over life and death, vitae necis potestas, for his children, the right to sell them into slavery, and total control over their property and marriages. While by Nero's time the most extreme applications of this power were rare and frowned upon by social custom, the legal framework remained. The emperor, as the symbolic father of the entire Roman state, was the ultimate paterfamilias. His household, the Domus Augusta, was a microcosm of the empire itself, and his authority within it was theoretically boundless. What a citizen might hesitate to do to his own son, an emperor, who viewed the entire world as his domain, would not. This legal framework was buttressed by a deeply stratified social structure that made human beings into commodities. Slavery was the bedrock of the Roman economy and society. Slaves were res, things, not personae, persons. They could be bought, sold, tortured, and killed with near impunity. Even upon being granted freedom, a former slave, a libertus or freedman, remained tied to their former master through a complex web of obligations known as obsequium. They owed their patron deference, services, and loyalty for the rest of their lives. Sporus's exact status before his encounter with Nero is debated by the ancient sources. Suetonius suggests he may have been a young freedman, while Cassius Dio is less specific. But whether he was born free, a freedman, or a slave, it mattered little. In the face of the emperor's will, such distinctions were academic. Nero could, with a word, strip a man of his freedom, his property, his very legal existence. To the emperor, everyone was, in a sense, his property. Sporus was therefore not an individual with rights to be violated, but a resource to be utilized, a piece of clay to be molded according to the emperor's grand, horrific design. The cultural and psychological landscape of Neronian Rome further paved the way for this tragedy. Roman sexuality, while often depicted as libertine, operated under a rigid set of unspoken rules centered on power and status, not morality in the modern sense. The key factor was not the gender of one's partner, but their social standing. A freeborn Roman male citizen could engage in sexual acts with slaves, prostitutes, and performers of either gender without social stigma, so long as he was the active, dominant partner. The passive role was seen as shameful and degrading, fit only for those of inferior status. Within this context, the existence of pueri delicati, delicate boys, who were kept by wealthy men as beautiful companions and sexual partners, was a known, if sometimes criticized, feature of elite life. These boys were almost always slaves, their youth and beauty commodified for the pleasure of their masters. Nero himself was known to indulge in this practice, surrounding himself with a retinue of such youths. What made the case of Sporus so shocking to Roman sensibilities was not the homosexual aspect of the relationship, but its flagrant violation of these power dynamics. By marrying Sporus, giving him the honors and title of an empress, and allegedly taking on the passive role in a public wedding ceremony, Nero was subverting the very core of Roman masculinity and propriety. He was not just taking a boy lover. He was attempting to transform a male of inferior status into a female of the highest possible status, a conceptual violence that scandalized even the jaded Roman elite. However, the ultimate catalyst was the unique and pathological psychology of Nero himself. Raised in a viper's nest of imperial intrigue, he ascended to the throne at 16, a boy handed the world. His early reign, guided by his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, was relatively stable. But as Nero consolidated his power, murdering his mother Agrippina and sidelining his advisors, his true nature emerged. He was not a traditional Roman statesman or general. He saw himself as an artist, a performer of divine talent. He craved the adulation of the crowd, competing in chariot races, singing on public stages, and writing poetry, all activities considered deeply shameful for an emperor. This obsession with performance and spectacle is crucial. For Nero, the world was a stage, and he was its lead actor and director. When his wife, Poppaea Sabina, died in 65 AD, according to Tacitus, as a result of Nero kicking her during a fit of rage while she was pregnant, his grief was inextricably linked with his theatrical worldview. Poppaea had been his ultimate audience and co-star, a woman famed for her beauty and ambition. Her loss created a void that his narcissistic and performative personality could not endure. His solution was not to mourn and move on, but to literally recast the role of his dead wife. This is where the story becomes a piece of grotesque theater. When Nero encountered Sporus, a youth whose features supposedly bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea's, he did not see a person. He saw an understudy. The decision to castrate Sporus was not merely an act of sexual mutilation. It was a costume fitting of the most extreme kind. To make the illusion more real, Sporus's biological masculinity had to be erased. The subsequent marriage was not a union of two people. It was a public performance of Nero's grief and power. He was demonstrating to the world that his will was so absolute that he could defy biology, law, and tradition. He could resurrect his dead wife by sheer force of imperial decree, carving her likeness onto the body and soul of a captive boy. The entire affair was a pathological spectacle, a private sorrow turned into a horrifying public drama, enabled by a system that had long forgotten how to say no to the man at its apex. Sporus was not the cause of Nero's madness, but its most tragic and complete expression, a human sacrifice on the altar of a broken psyche armed with unlimited power. The process of transforming Sporus from a boy into the Empress Poppaea was a masterclass in systematic dehumanization, a meticulous and cruel piece of psychological and physical engineering. It began with the selection. The ancient historians do not record the precise circumstances under which Nero's gaze first fell upon the young man. It was in the bustling slave markets of Rome, where beauty of all kinds was displayed and bartered like fine pottery. Or was he perhaps already a part of the vast imperial household, a servant or a pure delicatus whose unfortunate resemblance to the deceased empress was noticed by a sycophantic courtier and brought to the emperor's attention? Cassius Dio writes that Nero conceived a passion for the boy, a phrase that sanitizes the predatory nature of the encounter. It was not passion, but obsession, not a desire for Sporus, but a desire for a phantom. In Nero's eyes, Sporus's own identity was irrelevant, a mere obstacle. The boy's face was a mirror reflecting a ghost, and Nero became determined to make the reflection permanent. This selection was not an act of affection, but an act of appropriation. Sporus was identified, targeted, and claimed, his life no longer his own from the moment the emperor decided he was a suitable vessel. The second stage was the physical erasure, the act of castration. This brutal surgery, known to the Romans and practiced most notably in the Eastern courts they both disdained and emulated, was the linchpin of the entire monstrous project. For Nero, it served a dual purpose. It would prevent Sporus from developing further masculine characteristics, preserving a youthful, androgynous appearance that could be more easily molded into a feminine ideal. It would also render him sterile and sexually safe in a way that fit the perverse logic of the plan. The procedure itself, in a pre-anesthetic age, would have been an agony beyond modern comprehension, performed by physicians whose primary duty was not to the patient's well-being, but to the emperor's command. The physical pain, the risk of infection and death was immense, but the psychological violence was arguably greater. In one horrific act, Sporus was robbed of his biological future, his masculine identity, and his fundamental sense of self. It was a carving, a hollowing out, designed to make him an empty receptacle for Poppaea's memory. The act was a declaration. You are no longer a man. You are not yet a woman. You are a thing of my creation. You are my Poppaea. Suetonius reports this starkly, stating that Nero had the boy Sporus castrated and even tried to transform him into a woman, The chillingly casual phrase, "tried to transform him," speaks volumes about the clinical, experimental nature of the abuse. With his body violently altered, the indoctrination began. This was not merely a matter of forcing Sporus to wear women's clothing. It was a comprehensive re-education in being someone else. He was stripped of his name and was to be addressed only as Poppaea or Domina, lady or empress. He was compelled to study the mannerisms of the late empress, her way of walking, of speaking, of tilting her head. Tutors, likely terrified servants or sycophants, would have been tasked with this grotesque instruction. The Empress Poppaea held her fan thus. She would have laughed at that jest, but delicately, every natural impulse Sporus possessed had to be suppressed and replaced by a learned imitation. He was surrounded by Poppaea's former ladies-in-waiting, women who now served a living ghost, their faces a mixture of fear, pity, and revulsion. He was dressed in her finest silks, adorned with her jewels, his face painted with the same cosmetics she had used. This process was a form of psychological torture, a constant, unrelenting invalidation of his own existence. He was living in a dead woman's skin, his every moment a performance for an audience of one. The grieving, demented emperor who demanded perfect verisimilitude. The isolation would have been absolute, cut off from anyone who knew him as he was before, surrounded only by people who reinforced the fiction. The culmination of this transformation was the public formalization of the lie. Nero orchestrated a solemn marriage ceremony. According to Cassius Dio, the wedding took place in Greece during Nero's artistic tour in 67 AD. It was a lavish, public affair, complete with a dowry and the traditional flame-colored veil of a Roman bride. The entire imperial court was forced to attend and offer congratulations. This was the masterstroke of Nero's madness. He was not content to keep his reborn Poppaea in private. He demanded that the world ratify his delusion. He forced the Roman elite, senators, governors, generals, to participate in the charade, making them complicit in his crime. To object was to commit treason. They had to address Sporus as empress, to pay him the honors due to a consort of the emperor. The ceremony was a profound act of social and political humiliation for the Roman establishment, a demonstration that Nero's power was so total he could force them to accept a castrated boy as their queen. For Sporus, it must have been the final seal on his prison. Standing there in bridal attire, surrounded by the most powerful people in the world, he was utterly powerless, his identity officially and irrevocably erased by imperial writ. He was now, in the eyes of the law and the state, the Empress Poppaea Sabina, a fiction made flesh. The daily life of Sporus as the Empress Poppaea was a surreal and terrifying paradox. He was elevated to the highest station in the empire, yet he was the most powerless person within it. He lived in the opulent splendor of the imperial palace, but it was a gilded cage of unimaginable cruelty. His days were a regimented performance. He would be woken by servants who addressed him as Domina, bathed and dressed in the extravagant finery of an empress. His every move was scrutinized, not for his own comfort or desire, but for its fidelity to the memory of his predecessor. Did he sit correctly? Did he use the right gestures? A moment of forgetfulness, a lapse back into his own natural mannerisms, could provoke the emperor's unpredictable wrath. The psychological pressure must have been immense, a constant state of high alert, of playing a role for his life. He ate from gold plates, but the food likely tasted of ash. He slept in soft linens, but sleep would have been a refuge constantly threatened by the presence of the man who was both his husband and his creator, a man whose love was a form of annihilation. Public appearances were the most perilous aspect of his existence. Nero delighted in showing off his creation. Suetonius records that Nero took him on a tour of Greece. Riding in a litter with a whole retinue of maids and attendants, he was displayed during the great festivals and public games, seated beside Nero in the imperial box, a silent, beautiful effigy for the Roman people to behold. The reaction of the crowd would have been a mixture of awe, confusion, and mockery whispered behind hands. They saw an empress, but they knew the story. They saw the lie. For Sporus, these moments must have been excruciating, exposed to the gaze of thousands, his humiliation a public spectacle. He was the emperor's most bizarre trophy. One recorded incident captures the black, tragic irony of his situation perfectly. A Roman wit, observing the couple, is said to have remarked, "It's a pity that Nero's father didn't have the same kind of wife." The joke, a grim reference to Nero's murderous mother Agrippina, spread through the city. It highlights how Sporus had become a symbol, a punchline in the dark comedy of Nero's reign, his personal suffering abstracted into a commentary on imperial politics. The psychological toll of this existence is difficult to fathom, but we can speculate based on our understanding of trauma and abuse. Sporus was the victim of what we might today call profound identity abuse. He likely experienced a form of dissociation, a mental splitting from his own reality as a coping mechanism. To survive, he may have had to believe in the performance to some degree, to internalize the identity of Poppaea as a shield against the unbearable truth. He was entirely dependent on Nero for his survival. This could have fostered a complex trauma bond, often mistaken for loyalty or even affection. Nero was the source of all his pain, but also the source of all his food, shelter, and protection from hostile court. To hate his tormentor openly was impossible. To please him was the only path to survival. This created a twisted dependency where the line between captor and protector blurred into a nightmarish fog. He was surrounded by luxury, but consumed by loneliness, the only person in the world living his specific horror. There were no peers, no one to confide in. The ladies-in-waiting were guards, the courtiers were spectators. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone in his imperial prison. The end of his service as Nero's empress came not through escape or rescue, but through the collapse of the entire system that had created him. As Nero's reign descended into its final, paranoid phase, Sporus was a constant presence, a silent witness to the emperor's unraveling. When the rebellion of Vindex in Gaul triggered a cascade of political and military betrayals, Nero's world fell apart. The Senate, so long cowed into submission, found its courage and declared Nero an enemy of the state. He was forced to flee the palace, his life now forfeit. In these final, pathetic hours, Sporus was one of a tiny handful of companions who remained with him. The histories record that Nero, disguised and on the run, fled to a villa owned by his freedman Phaon. With him were Phaon, another freedman named Epaphroditus, and Sporus. The image is haunting, the fallen god, stripped of his power, accompanied by the living symbol of his greatest excess. Why did Sporus stay? Was it loyalty born of a trauma bond, or the simple pragmatism of a survivor who knew that leaving the emperor's side meant certain death in the chaotic streets? Perhaps he was simply too broken and institutionalized to imagine any other existence. He was there as Nero lamented his fate, famously crying out, "Qualis artifex perio?" "What an artist dies in me," is a line dripping with the ultimate self-absorbed narcissism. Even at the moment of his own destruction, Nero's primary concern was the loss of his own perceived genius. He likely gave no thought to the fate of the boy he had destroyed to create his final, living masterpiece. As Nero took his own life with the help of Epaphroditus, Sporus stood by, the curtain falling on the first act of his tragedy, only to find that the second was about to begin. The death of his creator did not bring freedom. It simply made him a prize to be claimed by the next man to crave power. The fall of Nero in 68 AD plunged the Roman world into the chaos of civil war, a bloody period known as the Year of the Four Emperors. For Sporus, the emperor's death was not a liberation, but a terrifying transition. He was no longer the property of a single, all-powerful tyrant, but a piece of living plunder, a notorious symbol of the fallen regime, to be passed between ambitious and ruthless men. His unique and tragic fame made him a desirable object, a trophy that connected its owner to the mystique and power of the dead emperor. His ordeal was far from over. It was merely entering a new, more volatile phase. The system of exploitation that had created him was not dismantled with Nero's death. Its mechanisms were simply seized by new operators. His life became a horrifying illustration of how a victim of systemic abuse can be endlessly re-victimized by the successors who inherit the wreckage. The first to claim him was Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Nymphidius had been instrumental in turning the guard against Nero, a betrayal he hoped would pave his own way to the throne. As part of his bid for power, he moved to seize the symbols of imperial authority, and in his mind, Sporus was one of them. He took Sporus into his own custody, continuing the grotesque charade Nero had begun. He called Sporus Poppaea, forced him into the role of his consort, and treated him as his own personal empress. This was a calculated political act. By possessing Nero's wife, Nymphidius was attempting to create a lineage of sorts to present himself as Nero's rightful successor. For Sporus, it must have been a waking nightmare renewed. The script was the same, but the lead actor had changed. He was once again trapped in the identity of Poppaea, forced to perform for a new master, a brutish soldier whose motivations were not rooted in some twisted grief, but in pure, cynical political ambition. Nymphidius's grab for power was short-lived. He was killed by his own Praetorian guards when they declared their loyalty to Galba, the governor of Spain who was marching on Rome. Sporus was, for a brief moment, unowned, a piece of human wreckage in a city tearing itself apart. His respite was fleeting. The next man to ascend to the imperial throne, albeit briefly, was Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho's connection to Sporus was even more personal and layered with dark irony. Otho had been the first husband of the real Poppaea Sabina before Nero, then his friend, had seen her, desired her, and exiled Otho to Lusitania, modern-day Portugal, to take her for himself. Now, with Nero dead and Galba assassinated, Otho was emperor. Upon taking power, he too took possession of Sporus. Otho's motivations are more ambiguous than Nymphidius's. Was it a twisted act of nostalgia for the wife he had lost to Nero? Was he trying to reclaim a piece of his past by possessing the boy who had been made into her image? Or was it, like Nymphidius, a political gesture? Otho had adopted the name Nero as part of his own name to appeal to the city's common people, who had retained a strange affection for the dead emperor. Taking in Nero's widow may have been part of this branding strategy. Whatever the reason, the effect on Sporus was the same. He was once again passed from one man to another, his body and identity not his own. The ancient historian Suetonius notes that Otho showed favor to Sporus, but in this context, favor is a deeply unsettling word. It meant continued existence in the same gilded cage, the same performance of feminine identity that was not his, for a man who had known and loved the very woman Sporus was forced to impersonate. This must have added a new layer of psychological complexity and torment to his existence. Otho's reign lasted a mere 3 months. He was defeated in battle by the forces of Aulus Vitellius, the commander of the Rhine legions. Rather than face capture or prolong the civil war, Otho committed suicide, an act praised by some Romans as a noble sacrifice to restore peace. For Sporus, it meant another change of ownership. He now fell into the hands of Vitellius, a man known for his gluttony and cruelty, a coarse and brutish emperor who represented the very antithesis of Nero's artistic pretensions. For Vitellius, Sporus was not a symbol of lost love or a tool of political branding. He was simply a freak, a curiosity from a despised predecessor's court, and an object to be used for public amusement. Vitellius conceived of the most degrading fate yet for the boy. He planned to use Sporus as a character in a public spectacle, a gladiatorial entertainment or theatrical performance in the arena. This was the ultimate debasement, a shift from the private, psychological horror of the palace to the raw, public humiliation of the amphitheater. The specific role Vitellius had in mind was stomach-churning. According to Cassius Dio, the plan was to have Sporus play the lead role in a dramatic reenactment of the myth of Persephone, or Proserpina in Roman mythology. specifically her abduction and rape by Hades, the god of the underworld. In this public performance, Sporus would be cast as the maiden goddess, and his violation would be staged for the entertainment of the Roman masses. Whether the rape was to be simulated or real is horrifyingly unclear, but in the brutal world of the Roman arena, the line was often non-existent. Condemned criminals were frequently killed in mythological reenactments, their deaths providing a grisly form of verisimilitude. For Sporus, this was the final, unbearable indignity. He had been transformed from a boy into an empress, a private work of art for a madman. He had been passed between pretenders as a political symbol. Now, he was to be reduced to a sexual prop in a bloody public show. His trauma turned into a spectator sport. The system had found its most vicious and public way to consume him. It was in this moment, facing the prospect of ultimate public degradation, that Sporus finally found a path to agency. Throughout his ordeal, his resistance had been necessarily passive, the quiet endurance of a survivor. He had survived Nero, Nymphidius, and Otho by being pliant, by performing the role demanded of him. It was a strategy of survival born of absolute powerlessness. But the plan of Vitellius presented a horror that survival could not justify. To be publicly violated in a theatrical spectacle was a fate worse than death. It was the complete and final annihilation of any shred of dignity he had managed to preserve within himself. He was trapped, with no allies and no hope of rescue. The machinery of the state, now in the hands of Vitellius, was moving to put him on that stage. He could not fight the emperor. He could not flee the city. He could not appeal to any law for protection. The system that had unmade him was now preparing to devour him for sport. In the face of this absolute checkmate, Sporus located the only form of resistance left to him, the power to choose his own end. He refused to be a character in Vitellius's cruel play. He refused to allow his final moments to be a source of entertainment for a jeering crowd. He would not be the victim in their story. Instead, he would be the author of his own final chapter. Before the planned spectacle could take place, Sporus took his own life. The historical sources do not provide the details of his death, only the stark fact of it. He chose a private death over a public desecration. This act, in the context of his life, was not one of despair, but of profound defiance. It was the ultimate reclamation of his own body and his own narrative. For years, his body had been a canvas for others to paint upon, a stage for others to perform on. In his final act, he declared that his body was his own, and he would not lend it to their sick theater. It was a tragic victory, a grim triumph won at the highest possible cost, but a victory nonetheless. He denied the system its final, most grotesque satisfaction. He had been passed from man to man, from emperor to emperor, a silent pawn in their games of power. But in the end, he refused to make the final move they had planned for him. He swept the board clean himself. The story of Sporus did not die with him. It was recorded by the great Roman historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, who saw it as a potent and damning indictment of Neronian excess. For them, Sporus was a crucial piece of evidence in their political project of posthumously condemning the Julio-Claudian dynasty and justifying the new order. His suffering was useful. It served as a cautionary tale about what happens when an emperor transgresses all bounds of Roman tradition and decency. The memory of the boy empress became a permanent stain on Nero's legacy, a symbol of his tyranny more vivid than any political purge or military failure. The system that had destroyed him co-opted his tragedy one last time, turning it into propaganda. And yet, through their politically motivated accounts, the core of his story survived, a flicker of human truth preserved in the amber of historical invective. The evolution of his story, from personal trauma to political tool, ensures that we, 2 millennia later, can still bear witness. We can look past the political motivations of the historians and see the terrified boy on the marble floor, the haunted figure in the empress's silks, and the defiant soul who chose oblivion over a final, public humiliation. His story declined from a lived reality into a historical anecdote, but in doing so, It achieved a kind of immortality, a permanent testament to the depths of human cruelty and the enduring power of a single, final act of will. In the final accounting of history, it is the grand narratives that command our attention. The rise and fall of empires, the clash of armies, the edicts of powerful men. But the true measure of a society, the real texture of its moral fabric, is often found in the stories that are whispered, in the fates of those who had no voice, no power, and no choice. The life and death of Sporus is one such story. It is a chronicle of almost unimaginable suffering, a journey through the concentric circles of a private hell made manifest by public power. He endured a brutal physical mutilation that was simultaneously a psychic assassination, the systematic erasure of his identity. He was forced into a performance of femininity as a living memorial to a dead woman, his existence a constant, high-stakes lie. He was an empress with no authority, a bride with no love, a human being treated as a therapeutic object, a piece of art sculpted from living, screaming flesh. After the death of his tormentor, he did not find freedom, but was passed like a spoil of war between usurpers, his unique trauma making him a valuable political commodity, until he faced a final, unendurable degradation. The central, searing theme of this narrative is the absolute horror of systemic dehumanization. Nero was not simply a rogue individual acting out a private fantasy. He was the apex of a system, the Roman imperial structure, that gave his personal pathology the force of law and the tools of the state. The physicians who performed the surgery, the courtiers who addressed Sporus as domina, the officials who organized the monstrous wedding, none of these were necessarily evil in themselves. They were cogs in a machine of power, functionaries of a system where obedience to the emperor superseded all other moral, ethical, and human considerations. Sporus's tragedy shows us that the most profound atrocities are often not the result of a single monster's actions, but the product of a systemic failure of humanity, where an entire social structure becomes complicit through fear, ambition, or simple indifference. It is a chilling reminder that systems, not just individuals, can be pathological. The moral lesson that echoes down to us from the tragic silence of Sporus is one of profound significance for our own time. His story is a testament to the fundamental human need for dignity, autonomy, and identity. We live in an age that fiercely debates the nature of identity, the right to self-determination, and the sanctity of the individual against the pressures of society. The story of Sporus provides a historical anchor for these modern values, showing us the terrifying alternative. It illustrates, in the most extreme terms imaginable, what it means to have one's identity stolen, to have one's body and name redefined by an external power. The rights we now consider fundamental, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to define our own identity, the right to be seen as a person and not an object, were not granted. They were fought for, often by nameless victims whose suffering laid the groundwork for future freedoms. Sporus's final act of defiance, his choice of suicide over spectacle, was his desperate, tragic claim to a right we now hold to be self-evident, the right to be the author of one's own story. We are therefore called not just to remember Sporus as a historical curiosity, but to honor his memory as a cautionary tale. To remember him is to acknowledge the fragility of human dignity in the face of unchecked power. It is to recognize that the impulse to control, to define, and to possess others is a timeless human failing, one that can manifest in empires and in households. His story compels us to value the legal and social frameworks that protect the individual, to be vigilant against the erosion of rights, and to cultivate an empathy that sees the person behind the label, the humanity behind the role. He was a boy forced to become a queen, a living person forced to become a ghost. His existence was an agony, and his end a tragedy. But in remembering him, we reaffirm the principle for which he died, that no person's grief, no person's power, and no person's desire ever grants them the right to unmake another human being. History is filled with the clamor of emperors and the clash of swords, But its most profound truths are often found in the silences between the lines, in the erased identities and the forgotten names. Sporus was meant to be a footnote, a living prop in another man's drama, his humanity sacrificed for a tyrant's sorrow. But by choosing the manner of his own exit, he ensured his story would not be just about his victimization, but also about his final, desperate resistance. He haunts the edges of Roman history not as Nero's phantom bride, but as a stark symbol of the indestructible human spirit, which, when robbed of all other choices, can still find a freedom to say no in the only language the system has left it. His tragedy poses a question that reverberates through the ages. What is the worth of a single, powerless life when weighed against the will of an empire? And what does it say about us if we ever forget the answer?